This month I read 11 books. 5 middle grade fantasies, 4 romances, 1 YA romance, and 1 cozy fantasy. Listened to 7 audiobooks, read 3 books on my Kindle, and 1 physical book. I mentioned in my February wrap-up that I thought this month was going to look a little different reading-wise, and that's because at the beginning of March, I actually started a new job. It's my first full-time job since I graduated college, and I knew that was going to shake up my routines a little bit, specifically with my reading habits, which explains why I listened to 7 audiobooks this month. With that being said, let us jump into the 11 books that I read in March. The first audiobook that I listened to was The Lost Hero by Rick Riordan. This is the first book in the Heroes of Olympus series, which is a sequel series to Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I'm gonna be honest, when I read Percy Jackson, I didn't know that there were so many other books and series in this universe. I didn't really know what I was in for reading that first Percy Jackson book, because I was kind of confused when I read that series and people were like, oh my gosh, I love Percabeth, and I was reading it and there really wasn't a whole lot of them together as a couple. It's because I didn't read all the books yet. It took me a little while to get into it and understand what was going on, because you're following a completely different set of characters in this book than in Percy Jackson and the Olympians. But once I got into it, I was into it. I listened to this in a couple of days and I loved all the new characters that we got introduced to. I thought this book was so funny and I loved all the action sequences in here, and I just overall had a really good time reading this. I gave this a 4 stars. Which is how I ended up jumping immediately into The Son of Neptune by Rick Riordan, the second book in the Heroes of Olympus series. The structure of this series is very different than Percy Jackson and the Olympians, because you're following many different characters and also switching POVs basically every chapter. But Rick Riordan does such a great job with character development that it's really not hard to figure out who is talking in every chapter. And with the way that Rick Riordan tells these stories, it would be very easy for these stories to get quite repetitive with the same thing happening over and over, of them fighting gods and monsters. But the way that he tells these stories, it is so intriguing every time. I rated this one a 4 stars as well. Then I read Just Friends by Haley Pham. This book, you're following Blair and Declan. They are childhood best friends turned sweethearts. But something happened, they broke up, and now they haven't spoken to each other in years. But Blair moves back to their hometown to spend some time with her aunt who is ill. And while she's there, she decides that she's going to get a job at a coffee shop. And who runs the coffee shop? Of course, Declan does. I have a whole reading vlog dedicated to reading this book, so I won't say too much, but I will say overall it was a bit underwhelming with how excited I was about it. When it came to the emotional subplots, there were just too many, and so we didn't really get to dive super deep into any of them, and the resolutions super unsatisfying. I did really enjoy the scenes between Blair and Declan, and I loved Declan's character as a whole, but when it came to the emotional side of Blair's story, I just really didn't care. So I rated this a 3.5 stars. Then I read The Mark of Athena by Rick Riordan. Another thing that I really enjoy about Rick Riordan's storytelling is that over the whole series, you're following one big plot point, one conflict. There are smaller subplots, smaller conflicts that are resolved at the end of the books, but overall they encompass one big conflict. And I feel like more and more you're seeing fantasy series where each book is following a different conflict, which is really not, to me, the best way to go about writing a fantasy series. When you are following the same conflict for a series of books, you get really swept up in the world and you are drawn to turn the page to see what happens next and pick up the next book when you're left on a cliffhanger. And really, it just ups my enjoyment of a story overall. I rated this book a 4 stars. Then I listened to House of Hades. Can you tell I'm in my audiobook era? I think at this point I have listened to more audiobooks than I did from 2022 to 2025. This book almost got me in trouble at work because I was sitting in my cubicle having to stifle my laughter at how funny this book was. I had such a fun time listening to this book, but genuinely, it was a funny book. I rated this a 4.5 stars. If you were expecting the next book that I listened to be The Blood of Olympus, the final book in the Heroes of Olympus series, you would be incorrect, because next I listened to The Demigod Diaries, which is a novella in this series. It's kind of encompassing a series of short stories. One, you're following some of the characters in a scene that happens between the events of 2 of the books. You're getting a little bit more insight into Luke, who is one of the main antagonists in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. And then another short short story that kind of explains the lives of the Half-Bloods that are not at Camp Half-Blood, because they do exist for one reason or another, and I had never really thought about the fact that there were Half-Bloods that were not at Camp Half-Blood, and this story kind of explains like what their lives kind of look like. I rated this book a 3 stars. It was a very solid novella. Then I read Easy as Pie by Karina Taylor. This is the 5th book, I believe, in the Sweater Weather series, which is a cutesy little fall-themed clean romance series that I really enjoy. Each book is by a different author, and so you are getting a different look at Harvest Hollow, which is where the book takes place. This book specifically is following Hazel and Trip. They are childhood best friends, and Trip has just moved back to Harvest Hollow for a job opportunity, and Hazel is doing her best to try to avoid him because she actually is like wholly in love with him. But she doesn't want that to ruin their friendship, so she is doing her best to try to find the balance of being best friends while also trying to not let her feelings get in the way of their friendship. But also, you know, Trip is down on himself because he hasn't found someone to settle down with. Can you put 2 and 2 together? I loved the chemistry between these two characters, and the emotional connection that we got between the two of them was really well built, especially considering the fact that this book is less than 300 pages. That is something that some authors struggle to do, to build that emotional connection in such a short amount of time, but Karina Taylor was really able to build a solid emotional connection to where I could root for the characters and truly see why they were meant for each other. I think I read 75% of this book in one sitting. I rated this a 3.5 stars. The next audiobook I listened to, still not Blood of Olympus. It was The Summer of Broken Rules by K.L. Walther. This book was not what I was expecting. It's marketed as a young adult romance, but it had a lot of foul language and was closed door. I personally think that every young adult book should be a clean romance, but that's a conversation for a different day. And as far as the plot went, I had a really hard time following the events of the story, following the female main character, whose name I honestly cannot remember. And she is going to her family's property in Martha's Vineyard for a family wedding, and all of the friends and family and everyone who's going to the wedding is staying on the property for the week leading up to the wedding. And there were just so many characters introduced for tiny little scenes, and I could not keep them straight. Other than the main like 2 characters, I could not figure out who was supposed to be who, and every time a new name was brought up that I didn't remember who they were, it really just pulled me out of the story because it felt so disconjointed and I couldn't remember who was supposed to be who. So I had to just accept that I wasn't gonna remember who these different characters were and just move on and not fully understand what was going on in the book. And also the vibe of the romance was really just not for me. It was very insta-lovey, a very attraction-based romance, and that really is just not the kind of romance I really enjoy. And it had a lot of extreme infatuation, which just really doesn't sit right with me, especially in a YA romance. And the setting itself was not super descriptive. It takes place in Martha's Vineyard, which I feel like gives a lot of opportunity to be super descriptive about the vibes, about the ambiance of the setting, and I really just didn't get that from this book. And a super descriptive setting is something that I really enjoy in my books. Other people might not like it, but it's one of my favorite parts of books when an author is so descriptive with everything that has to do with the setting, and I can get a super clear picture in my mind of what's happening, and it's like watching a movie in my head. It makes me just love a book so much more, and I didn't get that from this. So I gave this a 2.75 stars. The next audiobook I listened to, still not The Blood of Olympus, the final book in the Heroes of Olympus series. I did listen to All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. Now this book, you're following Aurora, who has come to a point in her life where she needs a fresh start, so she decides to move back to the town where she grew up in to be connected to her mom that she lost several years ago. She runs a garage apartment and gets there only to find out that the teenage son rented the garage apartment for extra cash while his dad was supposed to be out of town, except his dad is no longer out of town and he doesn't really like that Aurora is there. And so she's just kind of bumbling along, trying to make a life for herself and make her landlord like her. I'm not going to say too much on this book because it is being featured in a reading vlog that is coming out very soon, but I will say that I loved this book so much. I laughed, I cried, I rated this 5 stars. Then I finally finished The Grimoire Grammar School by Caitlin Rozakis. This book took me so long to read. This book is following Vivian and her husband and their newly turned werewolf daughter as they are trying to navigate life in this new town full of magical beings. Vivian is trying to figure out how to be a good mom to her daughter, a good wife to her husband, who is struggling to wrap his head around this magical world that they now find themselves in, and also being on the PTA at the new school. And also, you know, maybe the impending doom of the town. It took me so long to finish this book. No joke, it took me 5 weeks to finish reading this book because when I wasn't reading it, I really wasn't thinking about it at all. I enjoyed it when I was actively reading the book, but when I wasn't, I was choosing to read other things when I had the chance, which was just a little bit disappointing for me because I was so excited about this book because the premise to me seemed really intriguing, very different from anything I usually read because this is more of a cozy fantasy and I usually don't really go for that, but that might also have something to do with the fact that I just really wasn't into the book when I wasn't reading it. But I did finally finish it and I gave it a 3 stars. And then the final book that I read in March was Wait For It by Mariana Zapata. Diana has just moved into a new house with her nephews that she has custody of, and they are adjusting to life in their new house within their new neighborhood, and they have a couple of neighbors that are maybe not so nice and maybe a little grumpy and don't really like Diana for now. This book is also in a future reading vlog. Are you sensing a theme here? Let me just say, the single parent trope lumped in with acts of service is something that I will absolutely melt for every single time. I love. I rated this a 5 stars. So those are the 11 books that I read in the month of March. I actually read so many more books than I had thought that I was going to. I mean, granted, most of them were audiobooks. I didn't do as much physical reading as I normally do in a month, as I like to do in a month, but I'm still so glad that I was able to adjust to life with my new job and figure out a way for me to continue reading, as it's my favorite hobby that I have, and find a way to balance that with my new job. You will probably from here on out be seeing a lot more audiobooks on my Goodreads. But anyways, guys, that is all I have for you guys today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up to let me know that you enjoy this type of content. Comment down below the last audiobook that you listened to and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content in the future. I hope you have a lovely rest of your week and I will see you guys next time.